Just before 8 a.m. on the morning of September 25, 1944, a police officer patrolled Day Street in Lower Manhattan in New York City. He passed the usual morning bustle, factory workers leaving the subway, telephone operators on their way to the nearby telephone and telegraph building, a food truck unloading vegetables at a dingy corner market, and someone begging for change outside an abandoned warehouse. Then, the officer noticed what looked like a heap of clothing just lying on the sidewalk ahead of him. The officer sighed and shook his head. He hated litter and took a lot of pride in keeping his streets clean. So the officer approached this pile of clothes, looking for a trash can to dump it in. But as he got closer, the officer realized this pile of clothes was actually an elderly man in a shabby overcoat. He was doubled over and clutching his stomach. The officer felt annoyed as the smell of stale alcohol and body odor rose from the old man's coat. He figured this man was just drunk after a long night out. So the officer bent down and shook the man's shoulder, asking if he was okay. Then, without warning, the old man turned over and vomited onto the sidewalk. The officer jumped back to avoid getting puke on his shoes. This old man was clearly very drunk and so could not be left on the streets alone. The officer had no choice but to arrest him for public intoxication. But as the officer reached for his handcuffs, he stopped because he noticed something very odd about this old man. His nose, lips, ears, and fingers were all as blue as the sky above. It was so strange that it took a moment for the officer to register what he was even seeing. Then, between this guy's blue skin, the glazed-over look on his face, and the vomit on the sidewalk, it clicked. This was not public intoxication, this was a medical emergency. So the officer ran to a payphone and called dispatch and requested an ambulance. Luckily, there was an emergency room close by at Beekman Downtown Hospital. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, so an ambulance arrived in just a matter of minutes. The officer helped one of the emergency responders hoist the old man off the sidewalk and onto a stretcher, and then they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The officer took a step back as the ambulance driver closed the door and then sped away. After the ambulance had disappeared around the corner and the police officer had resumed his beat, he thought to himself, in all his years on the force, that might have been the strangest thing he'd ever come across. A few minutes later, an attending physician named Dr. Francis Stevens ran outside of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He'd been notified about the incoming patient with the sky blue skin, and now he was rushing to meet the ambulance, pulling up out in front. Dr. Stevens helped the ambulance driver pull out a stretcher, and then using it, they carried the old man inside. The driver explained that although the old man had been awake when he was loaded into the ambulance, he had lost consciousness during the short drive to the hospital. Dr. Stevens nodded, guessing that his new patient had likely passed out from shock. He could tell from the man's skin color alone that his heart must not be pumping enough blood through his body, which meant he was at risk of a heart attack. As they transferred the old man from his stretcher to an actual hospital bed, Dr. Stevens saw that nearly half of this man's body had turned blue. Dr. Stevens jumped into action. They only had minutes to supply the old man's body with oxygen and then get his heart to pump it through his bloodstream. Without immediate treatment, this man would die. Dr. Stevens figured that the old man must have ingested something that made him this sick, so he raced to pump the man's stomach until he was sure it was empty. This meant that whatever had made him sick hopefully would not be able to do any more damage. The doctor then strapped an oxygen mask over the old man's face to increase the oxygen in his blood and then gave him stimulants to help his heart pump more efficiently. After this, there was nothing to do but wait. Dr. Stevens looked at the old man lying unconscious in the bed, his skin still bright blue, and the doctor just hoped they had treated him in time to save his life. Later that morning, Dr. Stevens returned to check on the old man and found him lying in bed, fully awake. His lips and fingertips did have a bluish tinge still, but the effect clearly had dramatically lessened. The man said his name was William and that he was 82 years old, and then after that he began looking around the room with very suspicious eyes and demanded to know what had happened to him. Dr. Stevens told William that he had been suffering from a condition known as cyanosis that results from inadequate oxygen in the bloodstream. Cyanosis is known for causing people's skin to turn blue. It was a rare condition, and they weren't sure why William had gotten it. Although Dr. Stevens could assure William that for the time being, the best treatment available was just to rest. This answer did not seem to satisfy William because his next question was, well, when do I get to go home? But before Dr. Stevens could answer him, the doors of the emergency room burst open and another unconscious man was carried into the waiting room. Dr. Stevens rushed from William's side to help this new patient. As the man was laid onto a bed, Dr. Stevens stopped and just stared at him with a look of surprise on his face. This new patient was also an old man dressed in tattered clothes, and as Dr. Stevens bent over him, he noticed that, just like William, this old man's lips, nose, and fingers were also bright blue. So Dr. Stevens administered the same treatment he'd just given William: a stomach pump, an oxygen mask, and heart stimulants. But as he was working on this new patient, Dr. Stevens started to have this sinking feeling in his gut. 2 cyanosis cases on the same day? What was that about? He knew that in rare cases, cyanosis was a symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning. He worried that there might be a gas leak in a nearby building, and in a neighborhood as crowded as Lower Manhattan, that could be disastrous. Dr. Stevens was able to stabilize this new patient's condition, but the doctor didn't have a moment to rest. Almost immediately after this second patient was stable, he heard another ambulance pull up out front, and seconds later, 3 more people were carried in. And from across the room, Dr. Stevens could already see that all 3 of them were elderly, run-down men, and they were all bright blue. Now, Beekman Downtown Hospital had a total of 5 cyanosis patients. Dr. Stevens and his staff worked through the entire morning to save these 3 new blue patients, and then just before lunch, 2 more blue men were carried in, and 10 minutes later, another 2. Dr. Stevens was totally confused. Something in the city had to be making all these men sick, but it just was not clear what it was. By noon, there were 9 ragged elderly men who had blue skin who were laid out in the hospital's beds. Dr. Stevens and his staff ran from bed to bed, administering treatment until all 9 men were totally stabilized and their skin was slowly turning back to its normal color. It was only then that Dr. Stevens had a moment to step back and actually go look at the men's admission papers. These documents revealed that all of the men had been found on sidewalks or in condemned buildings all around the neighborhood. Dr. Stevens didn't know what to make of this, but the fact that the men were coming from different places meant that a single gas leak probably could not have made them all sick. But if it wasn't gas poisoning, what was making these men turn blue? Dr. Stevens worried it could be some kind of airborne illness or virus, and so even though Dr. Stevens did not really know what was going on, he knew it was now time to report this outbreak to the Department of Health. About an hour later, a field epidemiologist with the New York Department of Health named Dr. Ottavio Pelletieri walked through the doors of Beekman Downtown Hospital. He showed his identification to the receptionist and asked to speak with the physician who was in charge. Dr. Pelletieri's job was to investigate possible outbreaks of disease. His eyes wandered around the emergency room. Of the 9 blue-skinned patients laying in the beds against the wall, only 5 of them were awake. Dr. Pelletieri focused on William, who was the first patient brought in that morning. William was sitting upright in his bed, his skin still somewhat blue, but he was clearly feeling better. Dr. Pelletieri walked over and introduced himself. He asked William about his morning. The old man coughed into his fist and then thought for a moment. He said at first it was just an ordinary day. He'd woken up in a nearby rooming house called the Globe Hotel, which was a crumbling, dingy building filled with as many twin beds as possible. After waking up, William said that he wandered down to breakfast at the Eclipse cafeteria, where low-income people could get a hot meal very cheap. He ate some oatmeal and drank some coffee, and then started back to his boarding house. And when he reached the sidewalk right outside of the Globe Hotel, he suddenly started feeling these stabbing pains inside of his stomach. Then he fell to the ground, and the next thing he knew, he was in this hospital bed. Just as Dr. Pelletieri was about to open his mouth to ask William some follow-up questions, the cyanosis patient in the next bed over piped up and said that he also had eaten at the Eclipse cafeteria that morning. Dr. Pelletieri raised his eyebrows. He stepped away from William's bed and asked the 5 conscious patients if they'd also eaten at Eclipse that morning. And all of them nodded yes, they had. Dr. Pelletieri now knew where to start his investigation. Something obviously was wrong at the Eclipse cafeteria. The question was whether there was a carbon monoxide leak there or if something else in the restaurant had made these men sick. It could be food poisoning, though Dr. Pelletieri thought this was unlikely since the symptoms of food poisoning usually take at least 12 hours to manifest, and these men had passed out from pain and shock within just minutes of leaving the Eclipse cafeteria. Dr. Pelletieri then thought of something else that could have caused this quick and sudden illness. He took another sweeping look at the 5 conscious men in front of him and told them he had one more question. He promised they would not be in trouble, but he just had to know whether any of them had used a drug such as heroin that morning. There was a pause as the men stared back at him, but then all of them shook their heads no, and then told Dr. Pelletieri that they were actually drinkers, not drug users. They were all so serious that Dr. Pelletieri immediately believed them. Just then, a nurse walked up behind Dr. Pelletieri and tapped him on the shoulder. She pointed across the room to Dr. Stevens, the ER doctor, who was striding toward him. Dr. Pelletieri gave Dr. Stevens a nod and met him halfway across the room, extending a handshake. After the men shook hands, Dr. Pelletieri explained that he would need blood samples from all 9 patients. They'd be sent to the city toxicologist for overnight testing. Dr. Stevens nodded and agreed to help. For the next 10 minutes, the two of them moved from patient to patient, collecting small vials of blood and labeling them carefully. By the time they were done, all but one of the cyanosis patients were awake. The only one who remained asleep was a man named John Marshall. He was laid out in the bed closest to the wall, fully unconscious, skin still pale blue. Dr. Pelletieri looked John up and down before labeling his blood and placing it in a small box with the other samples. It was clear to Dr. Pelletieri that whatever had made these men sick, John must have gotten the worst of it. Dr. Pelletieri grabbed his briefcase full of samples and then left the emergency room. He dropped the samples at his office for testing and then head straight to the Eclipse cafeteria. If he could figure out what had happened, there might still be time to save John's life. Around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Dr. Pelletieri arrived at the Eclipse cafeteria to find it closed and locked up. But the lights were on inside, so the doctor knocked on the dingy glass door. When there was no answer, he knocked again, announcing himself loudly as a member of the health department. Finally, he saw someone inside pop out of the kitchen and hurry across the dining room. The man was dressed in a well-tailored trench coat and wore a suit. He unlocked the front door and opened it for Dr. Pelletieri and then introduced himself as Mr. Weinberg and said he was from the New York Bureau of Food and Drugs. He explained to Dr. Pelletieri that a secretary from the New York Department of Health had already called his office. Now that a restaurant was potentially responsible for the cyanosis outbreak, his department needed to be involved. Dr. Pelletieri felt grateful for the unexpected help, and so he stepped inside of the Eclipse cafeteria, and right away he was hit with this horrible smell. It was like an algae-filled aquarium. Dr. Pelletieri thought there must be so much mold lurking behind all the filthy and cracked tile walls. This place was so overdue for a proper cleaning that an inch of black grit clung to every corner of the floor. Dr. Pelletieri looked around the rest of the room, and he saw fruit flies climbing the walls. There were 17 rickety tables that filled the dining room, each with its own sticky bottle of ketchup and salt and pepper shakers. Weinberg told Dr. Pelletieri that he had not found a gas leak anywhere inside, but he'd already cited the cafeteria with 15 separate health code violations. The kitchen was even more disgusting than the dining room. A thick layer of grease clung to every surface, bags of rotting garbage sat beneath the kitchen sinks. Dr. Pelletieri picked up a fork lying on the counter, and a thick layer of starch coated the fork prongs. To him, everything inside of this cafe was a potential contaminant. It was only then that Dr. Pelletieri noticed the cook and the restaurant owner standing beside the oven. Dr. Pelletieri was even more surprised to find that both men looked genuinely upset, maybe even afraid. Dr. Pelletieri felt relieved. Usually, restaurant owners were combative when the health department showed up, but he guessed that these men were going to be cooperative. If they had something to do with these 9 men getting sick, it seemed very much like it was an accident. Dr. Pelletieri wanted to speak with the line cook first. He asked the man if he did anything different than usual when he cooked breakfast that morning. The line cook shook his head and said no. He had made the usual breakfast of oatmeal, rolls, and coffee, nothing different than every other morning. Dr. Pelletieri then followed the cook to the pantry, taking note of the type of dry cereal the cook had used to make 6 gallons of oatmeal. Then the cook led Dr. Pelletieri to the giant metal stock pot that he had used to both cook the oatmeal and then serve the oatmeal, enough to serve 125 people that morning. The cook rattled off the recipe: 5 pounds of that dry cereal, 4 gallons of city tap water, and a handful of salt. The cook gestured to a gallon can of salt sitting on the stove, and then he pointed to a series of canisters sitting on a shelf just above the stove. The cook explained they stored the salt there in bulk, then just refilled the salt can on the stove as needed. Dr. Pelletieri said he wanted to take samples from everything the men had cooked with that morning. Then the doctor grabbed a step stool to reach the canisters labeled table salt above the oven. And when he was up there and was eye level with these canisters, he noticed there was a different canister hidden amongst them, one that did not have a label. Dr. Pelletieri lifted that can off the shelf and looked inside, and to him it just looked like table salt. But just to be sure, Dr. Pelletieri climbed down from the stepladder and then showed this unlabeled can of white crystals to the cook and said, "What is this?" The cook explained that this can contained something known as saltpeter, which was a preservative he used to make corned beef and pastrami. The cook said he did not use the saltpeter to make oatmeal. For that, he used regular table salt. Dr. Pelletieri nodded, but just in case, he took a small sample of the saltpeter with him. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered if maybe there had been some kind of a mix-up and the cook had used saltpeter instead of table salt. But even if that had been the case, that would not have been what made all 9 of those men sick. Saltpeter was not toxic. Once Dr. Pelletieri had a bag full of all the samples he needed, he left the Eclipse cafeteria, hoping he would never have to return. Then he headed for the health department chemist's office. He needed these samples tested for poison overnight, along with the blood samples that he'd dropped off earlier. Dr. Pelletieri really wanted to get back to the hospital to check in on the 9 patients. But first, he had to make sure that this cyanosis outbreak was contained and that he was aware of every single cyanosis patient being treated right now in the city. He spent the next several hours visiting every cheap rooming house in the neighborhood, as well as all the nearby hospitals, until he was certain that the only cyanosis victims that were being dealt with right now were the 9 at the Beekman Downtown Hospital. When Dr. Pelletieri finally returned to the Beekman Downtown Hospital, it was well after midnight. And when he got there, a nurse greeted him and told him that since he had left the hospital that afternoon, 2 more elderly men had arrived with cyanosis, so blue skin. That brought the official count up to 11. Most of them were awake now and back to their normal coloring, but the sickest patient, John Marshall, still lay unconscious in his bed by the wall, and his situation seemed to only be getting worse. Dr. Pelletieri frowned and then thanked the nurse for the update. Then he headed back out the door toward his office to write his initial report, summarizing his investigation for his boss, Dr. Morris Greenberg, the city's chief epidemiologist. The next morning, Dr. Pelletieri had to go back to the Eclipse cafeteria, even though he really didn't want to. He was exhausted, having stayed up most of the night writing his report for his boss. But to continue his investigation, he would need to speak with more members of the kitchen staff. When he got there, the cafeteria was still closed because of the health department citations, but the busboys and cashiers were waiting for Dr. Pelletieri inside the dining room. He chatted with each of them, following them around the cafeteria as they pantomimed their workdays. It didn't take long for Dr. Pelletieri to conclude that their actions had not contributed to the cyanosis cases in any significant way. But as Dr. Pelletieri packed up his belongings and got ready to leave, the cook from the day before appeared in the dining room with a fearful look on his face. He admitted to Dr. Pelletieri that he'd been up all night worrying that maybe, just maybe, he did accidentally season the oatmeal with saltpeter, not table salt, and if so, he was incredibly sorry. Dr. Pelletieri clapped the man's shoulder and thanked him for the honesty, but assured him not to worry. Since saltpeter is edible, it would not have hurt anyone if he had made that mix-up. The cook visibly relaxed, and Dr. Pelletieri smiled and wished him a good afternoon. Within an hour, Dr. Pelletieri made it back to the Department of Health to find a note on his desk from his supervisor, Dr. Greenberg. The test results from all the Eclipse cafeteria food samples had come back, and Greenberg wanted to see Dr. Pelletieri immediately. Dr. Greenberg was sitting at his desk, looking over the results, when Dr. Pelletieri showed up and knocked on his doorframe. Greenberg looked up for a moment and waved Dr. Pelletieri in. And then once Dr. Pelletieri took a seat, Greenberg handed him a copy of the results. And as Dr. Pelletieri read the findings, his eyes went wide. The cook had, in fact, accidentally refilled the gallon can of salt on his stove with saltpeter instead of table salt. But that was not the issue. The problem was that both the table salt and the saltpeter contained measurable levels of sodium nitrite, a meat preservative that can be poisonous if not handled carefully. Dr. Pelletieri knew that sodium nitrite wasn't dangerous in small doses, but large quantities of it could be deadly. For a moment, Dr. Pelletieri wondered how sodium nitrite could have gotten into the kitchen in the first place. It was more common at processing plants where meats like salami, hot dogs, and bacon were cured. And then Dr. Pelletieri remembered that because the nation was in the middle of World War II, the government had approved the use of limited concentrations of sodium nitrite in restaurants to make foods last longer. The sodium nitrite had to be used in very low concentrations that would preserve the meat, but allow any poisonous elements to burn off during the cooking process. But there was a big problem with the way the Eclipse cafeteria was using their sodium nitrite. The cooks were not just using it to preserve meat. They were also using it to season the morning oatmeal. And this was a critical mistake because oatmeal is not cooked nearly as long as meat is. During the longer meat cooking process, the toxins in sodium nitrite evaporate. But with oatmeal, they don't evaporate, and so when the cooks served it to the men, the toxins were definitely still in the oatmeal. And if that was not enough poison, the 11 men who were hospitalized had apparently gotten a whole lot more sodium nitrite straight from the salt shaker on their tables. Lab tests showed that one of the shakers at the Eclipse contained excess sodium nitrite, easily enough to sicken someone. Dr. Pelletieri put the lab results down and smiled. He finally had his answer. He would tell the restaurant about the mix-up right away, and as for the 11 blue men at the hospital, they were unlikely to suffer any long-term health problems from what had happened to them. Dr. Pelletieri thanked Dr. Greenberg, then got up to go spread the good news. That evening, Dr. Pelletieri stopped by the Beekman downtown emergency room on his way home. When he arrived, he learned that 10 of the 11 blue men had been released with a clean bill of health. When he called Dr. Greenberg to let him know, Greenberg said it was nothing short of a miracle. All of the survivors were self-proclaimed alcoholics, and alcoholics often crave salt. He was sure that all of them added salt liberally to their food, unwittingly putting their lives in danger. Dr. Pelletieri agreed, and he wanted to tell these men how lucky they were, but the survivors had been discharged and had all returned to their transient lives out on the streets. He knew he would likely never find them again. Still, they were part of a special group, survivors of being poisoned with sodium nitrite, an event so rare there were only 10 other cases of it ever in recorded history. But that was no help for the 11th blue man, John Marshall. His health had been so bad prior to consuming this sodium nitrite that he had died earlier that evening. Dr. Pelletieri's throat felt tight when he heard that news. He'd conducted his investigation as quickly as possible, but it still was not fast enough to save everyone. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the two officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these two officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the two police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these two officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the two officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the two police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris in his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. The next and final story of today's episode is called Rumble. Late on the night of May 27, 1995, a long-haul truck driver named Devin Williams pulled his gigantic refrigerated semi-truck into a truck stop in a city called Kingman, Arizona. After putting his truck in park, Devin reached over and grabbed his sleeping bag off the passenger seat and began to unroll it. Devin would normally get out and use the bathroom and brush his teeth before going to sleep for the night, but this night, Devin was so exhausted that instead of going in, he just unfurled that sleeping bag and then climbed behind the front two seats of his truck and got into what's called the sleeper cab, which is an area behind the front two seats in the cab where drivers can lay down and rest. Devin had been on the road for the last 4 days, basically non-stop, and all he wanted to do was just finish the stupid route and get back home to his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in the tiny town of Americus in Kansas. Devin hated being away from his family for long periods of time, which unfortunately was part of his job, being a long-haul truck driver, but they needed the money because he and his wife had just bought a new house and it was a total fixer-upper, and so they needed to do a whole bunch of repairs to turn that house into a home. And so, missing his family and just wishing he was done with this route, Devin laid in his sleeping bag in the sleeper cab trying to fall asleep, but he just couldn't. And unfortunately, as Devin knew, if he didn't sleep this night, then he would have to take another break later on this route to rest because he couldn't just continue to drive with absolutely no sleep. And so taking an additional break that he was not prepping for could affect his ability to get home on time. It was Saturday night, and the strawberries and lettuce that Devin was hauling inside of his truck were due in Kansas City, Missouri, 1,300 miles away, on Monday morning. And so Devin began doing the math in his head. If he stopped a little while later to take another sleep break, would he still be able to cover those 1,300 miles by Monday? And he just wasn't sure. Everybody at the trucking company where Devin worked knew the 29-year-old as being very easygoing and good-natured. Trucking was very hard. People drove insanely long hours on very little sleep, and some people even took drugs to stay awake even longer to make sure they hit their deadlines. And so truckers have kind of earned the reputation of being very rough and tough people. And Devin certainly looked rough and tough. He was this big guy who wore cowboy hats, he had a big Fu Manchu mustache, he had tattoos. But in reality, despite how he looked, he was actually like a gentle giant. And really all he talked about were his kids, who he was totally devoted to. The only time anyone at this company saw Devin get mad was when his work interfered with his ability to see his family. And now, as Devin tossed and turned inside of his sleeper cab, he was getting mad because he was thinking this stupid route and his inability to sleep during this particular break was very likely going to interfere with seeing his family. And after an hour of Devin getting angrier and so not sleeping at all, he finally just gave up on sleep. He chucked his sleeping bag, he climbed out of the cab, and he headed into the truck stop where he went to the bathroom, he got a bite to eat, and then he called his boss, and he told him that he had just made a stop in order to sleep, but he couldn't, and so he was just gonna hit the road again. But don't worry, even though I need another break in order to sleep, I will be in Kansas City on Monday morning with this delivery on time. After speaking to his boss, Devin left the truck stop, climbed back into his truck, he fired it up, and then before long, he was back on the highway, driving east. Devin's boss was a guy named Tom Wilson, and he didn't find anything unusual about this phone call he got from Devin. Maybe it was a little unusual that Devin was unable to sleep, and that he called his boss to say he was unable to sleep, but Devin sounded totally normal. And so that night, Tom was not worried at all that Devin would not make it to Kansas City by Monday morning. Devin was like one of his most reliable guys, and so if Devin said he was going to be there on Monday morning, even if he needed extra breaks along the way, then he would be there on Monday morning. But on Monday morning, the distribution center in Kansas City, Missouri, where Devin was supposed to go and drop off the lettuce and strawberries, called Tom Wilson and they said, "Hey, your driver's not here yet. What's going on?" Now, at first, Tom was actually really annoyed with the distribution center because he felt like, okay, the clock has just struck the deadline. Devin will likely arrive in the next few minutes and they're prematurely calling to complain. And so Tom communicated that to the distribution center and they said, okay, fine, we'll wait a little bit longer. But when almost an hour passed and still Devin had not shown up, the distribution center called Tom back and said, hey, he's not here. Now, after the second call, Tom totally changed his mindset and he was actually now worried about Devin. And so he apologized to the distribution center and said he would get in touch with Devin as soon as he could and figure out where their shipment was. But Tom couldn't just call Devin and ask where he was and what was going on because this was back in 1995. They didn't have cell phones. And so Tom basically just had to wait for Devin, who's out on the road somewhere, to stop somewhere and call Tom to tell Tom what's going on. And so all day Monday, Tom sat at his desk waiting for a call from Devin. And when he didn't get a call from Devin, Tom began calling his other drivers all over the country, asking them if maybe they had had some sort of interaction with Devin and knew where he was and why he had not made it to Kansas City on time. But none of the drivers had any idea what was going on with Devin. No one had spoken to him. Then, that evening, Tom got a call, but it was not from Devin. It was from Devin's wife, Mary Lou. And she was calling to say, "Where's Devin? He was supposed to be home by now, and he's not. I haven't heard from him in days. What's going on?" And at this, Tom suddenly thought, okay, we have a real problem here. And so when Tom explained to Mary Lou what was going on with Devin, how he had missed this deadline, Mary Lou panicked and immediately called the police. A little while later, a police officer in Americus, Kansas, arrived at Mary Lou's house to take down the missing person report. And after they did that, the deputy assured Mary Lou that very likely her husband would be found and he would be just fine. And so they explained to Mary Lou that what they would do is put out an alert to all the different police departments that fell kind of roughly along the route that Devin's truck had been on and see if any of them had had some sort of interaction with Devin. You know, maybe he got into an accident, maybe his truck broke down and he was stranded somewhere, maybe he was hospitalized, who knows, but very likely one of these police departments would know where Devin was. And sure enough, after this alert went out, the officer got a call back very quickly from a sheriff's department in a place called Coconino County, Arizona. Coconino County was located 200 miles to the east of Kingman, Arizona, which was where Devin had been on Saturday night but couldn't sleep and then called his boss to say he was going to hit the road again. But interestingly, the sheriff's department in Coconino County made it very clear to the police officer in Americus, Kansas, that they had no idea where Devin was, but they definitely knew where his truck was. In fact, basically everybody in Coconino County knew where Devin's truck was. It was all anybody in that county was talking about. Because on Sunday, so the day before Devin was reported missing, somebody driving Devin's truck spent the entire day terrorizing hikers and campers inside of the Tonto National Forest in Coconino County. The Tonto National Forest, which is 600,000 acres of just rugged wilderness preserve, was nowhere near Devin's trucking route. In fact, it wasn't near any trucking route ever. It's like 20 miles off of the highway, and the roads in the forest are barely wide enough to support small cars going through, let alone a 48-foot long, massive 10-ton semi-truck like Devin was driving. But on Sunday morning, so roughly 8 hours after Devin had called his boss Tom, two hikers named Lynn and Jack Yarrington were in their tent inside of Tonto National Forest, just having a nice time. It's peaceful, it's quiet, and they're right near this dirt road that kind of bent around a corner. And suddenly, they began to hear a rumbling sound coming from one end of this road. And so they were in their tent, they unzipped it, they looked out, and at first, all they saw on the road coming in their direction was this huge cloud of dust and smoke. And then through the dust and smoke came Devin's humongous truck blazing down this road at practically full speed. And at first, Jack and Lynn are like, how is this truck even in the forest? How did it get here? How did it actually manage to drive to this point? And after Devin's truck whizzed past them and blazed off in the other direction out of sight, Lynn and Jack weren't scared or worried. They were just totally confused. And so they began speculating, like, well, maybe the driver got lost and they're trying to find a place to turn around or something. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, they heard a rumbling sound and they saw another cloud of dust, and it was Devin's truck now coming back in the other direction on this same dirt road. And so Jack and Lynn, they kind of backed up behind their tent, and they watched as this truck blazed past them again, flying out the other direction. And so in some ways, that kind of confirmed to Lynn and Jack that yes, this driver, who's definitely driving recklessly at this point, has likely gotten lost, they've managed to turn around, and now they're heading back out to the highway, and that's all this was. And then all of a sudden, as they're kind of chatting about it and laughing about it, they hear the sound of the truck coming back again. And they look up, and sure enough, there's Devin's truck barreling down the road again. Except this time, Jack and Lynn, they looked where Devin's truck was going, and they saw there was a small sedan coming up the road in the opposite direction. So Devin and the sedan are going to collide, and because this road was actually on a turn, the driver of the sedan couldn't actually see the truck, and the driver of the truck, whether it was Devin or somebody else, couldn't see the sedan. And so both drivers are driving towards each other without realizing it. And so Jack and Lynn, they jump up, they begin screaming and yelling at the driver of the truck to slow down. But the truck didn't slow down. It just continued coming down the road. And the sedan driver, he saw Jack and Lynn flailing their arms and trying to get somebody to stop on the road. And so sensing there was another car, the sedan came to a full stop. And then right in front of them, they saw this truck come barreling around the road. And so the sedan began backing up wildly, trying to get out of the way of this huge truck. And then finally, the driver of the sedan just cut the wheel and peeled off the side of the road into the brush. And right as they did, the truck, which had not slowed down at all, even though the driver could have clearly seen the sedan, just whizzed right past the sedan and would have smashed into it if the sedan had not jumped off the road. The driver of the sedan got out of the car, and when Jack and Lynn ran up to him to make sure he was okay, he would tell them that he got a good look at the driver of the truck as he drove past him, and he told them that the driver was just gripping the wheel, looking totally straight ahead, no expression whatsoever, just barreling past him. It was like he didn't even look at the sedan. He was just going. A little later that day, and not far from where this incident had just happened on this road with Jack and Lynn and this sedan, there was this family that was hiking through Tonto National Forest, and they had arrived at this big, beautiful open field in the middle of the forest, and they planned to have a picnic in this field. But as they came out of the tree line and walked into this beautiful open high grass meadow area, they looked out and they saw just kind of in the middle of the field was this huge truck that made no sense. How in the world could this truck have gotten to this meadow? They didn't know. But they clearly saw there's a truck, and the father of the family, he saw there was a man standing next to this truck, just kind of looking away from them off at the mountains in the distance. And so this family kind of assumed that the driver of this truck had somehow gotten into this meadow and maybe their truck was stuck, and so now they need help. And so the father told his family to stay put for a second, and then he, on his own, walked across the meadow towards this truck. And as the father got closer, he did see that very clearly the truck was stuck in the mud. And so this driver very likely is stranded. And so as he got close enough, the father yelled out to this guy and said, "Hey, do you need some help? We can go back and call someone. What can we do for you?" But the man who was standing outside of the truck didn't even turn around to talk to this father. He just kept standing there motionless, looking off into the distance. And so the father made it about 5 or 6 feet away from this guy, and the father just stopped and very clearly said, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Do you need help?" And at this point, the man who was standing next to the truck, he turned around and he looked at the father. And immediately the father kind of backed up for a second because there was something off about this guy. The guy was just kind of standing there and he was staring at the father, and he opened his mouth like he was about to speak. But instead of speaking, he just kept opening his mouth wider and wider until it was as wide as he could get it. And then he began wiggling his lower jaw back and forth as fast as he could, and then clicking his teeth simultaneously. And so the father just began backing up like there was something wrong with this guy. And right as the father was about to just turn around and leave and go protect his family from this guy, the guy stopped with his mouth, and then he just stared directly at the father and said very calmly, "I didn't do it. They did it." Now, when the father heard this, he was already so weirded out by this guy that he didn't even have any questions to follow up with. Instead, he just turned and began running back towards his family. And so feeling very unsettled, the family, they ran back to their car, they drove back home, and they called the police about this guy and his truck. It would take a deputy from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department a little while to finally navigate their way all the way out to this meadow where this truck and this guy apparently were. And when the deputy got there, they walked out into this meadow, and sure enough, just like the father had said, there was the truck stuck in the mud. And so the deputy began walking out to the truck, expecting to see the driver, this guy who the father had said was acting totally weird. But when the deputy got up there, he found the truck was totally abandoned. There was nobody in the cab, there was nobody nearby, it was just sitting here, but it was still running. And so the deputy tried to open up the cab, but it was locked. He did look inside, and everything looked very neat and orderly. And then he went around to the back of the truck, and he opened up the back doors, and he found the refrigeration unit was still on, and inside of this truck was lots and lots of strawberries and lettuce. So the deputy really didn't know what to make of this truck in the middle of the field, combined with this report that the father gave about this guy who was standing near it, acting totally weird. And so he just checked the license plate of the truck and he ran it against his database to see if there were any matching reports of missing trucks or missing truck drivers, but there weren't any. Because remember, this is on Sunday this is happening, and it wasn't until the next day, Monday, that Devin was reported missing and his truck was added to a list of missing trucks and missing truck drivers. And so the Coconino County deputy just called a towing company who came out and hauled Devin's truck out of the forest. And then 24 hours later, when Devin was reported missing, the Coconino County Sheriff's Department put it all together and contacted the officer in Americus, Kansas to say, okay, we do have Devin's truck, but we don't have any other answers for you. The behavior of the man who was driving Devin's truck through Tonto National Forest was so insanely out of character for someone like Devin that it seemed totally impossible that Devin could have done this. But both Lynn and Jack Yarrington and the other people who saw this truck flying through the forest on that Sunday, they all insisted that the man they saw in the cab driving this truck matched the picture of Devin Williams. But there was absolutely no reason for why Devin would want to go to the Tonto National Forest. And even if he did want to go to this forest for some reason, he should have known that his massive semi-trailer truck was not a good choice to be driving around these narrow dirt roads in the middle of this wilderness preserve. All we know about Devin is that at the time he went missing, all he likely wanted to do was just get home to Americus, Kansas to be with his wife and 3 kids again. That's really all he cared about. The police did consider that, maybe Devin just ran away, but that theory didn't add up. Devin had no criminal record, he had a great relationship with his wife, so there were no issues there, and there were no other kind of outstanding relationship issues with friends or family, and financially, even though it was a little tight, they were doing just fine. They just wanted some extra money to fix up this house and make it really nice. It wasn't like they were struggling to put food on the table. Also, the police considered that, maybe Devin was kidnapped or something. But Devin is like this big, imposing, tattooed, cowboy hat, big mustache, tough truck driver. I mean, who's gonna try to kidnap that guy? Devin also had no medical issues. He wasn't struggling with his mental health. He had no neurological abnormalities. He also never used drugs and always passed every single drug test that he got while working for this trucking company. Devin was basically just this totally normal, nice, well-adjusted guy with nothing to run or hide from. And so none of this made any sense.
She's walking through shadows, softly treading, heart beating like a drum, it's steadily spreading. The night whispers secrets she just won't ignore. She's searching for him, he's the light in her core. They flicker and gleam. His voice echoes softly like a distant dream. In the hush of the night, her hope burns bright. She'll find him, she's ready to fight. In the dark, she's calling out his name. She'll stake her claim. Love's her guide in this endless black. She knows he'll find his way back. Moonlight's a witness to her silence.
Police mounted a massive search inside of Tonto National Forest, and during this search, the couple, Jack and Lynn Yarrington, who had seen the truck barreling up and down the road and nearly collide with that sedan, they would tell searchers that they actually thought they saw Devin Williams, not in his truck, but out on foot, walking around on Monday morning, so just hours before he would have been reported missing. They said they just saw this guy wandering barefoot down the road as they were driving out of the forest, and they slowed down to ask him if he was okay, and this guy, who looked exactly like Devin Williams, responded by picking up a rock and throwing it at their car. And so Jack and Lynn just drove past him, not realizing that this was the guy who very likely was driving that truck. Now, the police, when they began this search, were pretty confident they would find Devin, especially after hearing from Jack and Lynn that he was pretty likely on foot and without shoes walking around the forest. It seemed like he could not get very far. But despite this huge search, they could not find Devin. There was absolutely no trace of him. And so, after nearly 3 weeks of searching and not finding Devin, the police called off the search. Then, on May 2nd, 1997, so almost exactly 2 years from when Devin had been reported missing, 2 hikers were walking on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest, right in the area where police had extensively searched for Devin 2 years earlier. These 2 hikers, they're walking on this trail, and up ahead they see there's this white thing right in the middle of the trail, just kind of sitting out. Now, this is a well-trafficked trail, and so they're wondering, what is this thing? And so they walk up and they see this white thing is a perfectly intact human skull. There's no skeleton, it's just the skull. And so these hikers, they gasp, they can't believe they're looking at a real human head, and they're thinking, how in the world did it get here? Why hasn't anybody else seen this and taken it? Like, how are we the first ones to see this? And so they would end up calling the police would come out, they'd gather up the skull, it would be sent in for testing, and sure enough, DNA testing would reveal the skull belonged to Devin Williams. No one has ever been able to explain what actually happened to Devin Williams. But the discovery of his skull inside of Tonto National Forest nearly guarantees that the driver of the truck 2 years earlier really was Devin, and the guy standing outside of the truck that was stuck in the mud in the meadow was likely Devin, and the guy throwing rocks at Jack and Lynn's car was Devin. People have put forth a whole host of theories about what happened to Devin, ranging from he had some sort of medical event where he kind of lost his mind and that's what caused all this strange behavior, or maybe Devin was on drugs despite not having any history of drug use. Maybe he took a really strong drug and that's what caused him to do all this. And still others believe that maybe there's a paranormal element to this whole story, that perhaps Devin was contacted by aliens, and that's what induced all the bizarre behavior, and then ultimately he was abducted by said aliens, and then somehow his skull wound up back on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest. And as crazy as that sounds, still to this day, no one has any idea what happened to him, so that theory is just as good as any other. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it.